Chapter 5. Paddington and the Finishing Touch. Mr. Gruber leaned on his shovel and mopped his brow with a large spotted handkerchief.
"If anyone had told me 3 weeks ago, Mr. Brown," he said, "that one day I'd have my own patio in the Portobello Road, I wouldn't have believed them. In fact," he continued, dusting himself down as he warmed to his subject, "if you hadn't come across that article, I might never have had one. Now look at it."
At the sound of Mr. Gruber's voice, Paddington rose into view behind a pile of stones. Lumps of cement clung to his fur like miniature stalactites. His hat was covered in a thin film of grey dust, and his paws, never his strongest point, looked for all the world as if they'd been dipped not once, but many, many times into a mixture of earth, brick dust and concrete. All the same, there was a pleased expression on his face as he put down his trowel and hurried across to join his friend near the back door of the shop, so that they could inspect the result of their labours. For in the space of a little over 2 weeks, a great and most remarkable change had come over Mr. Gruber's backyard, a change not unlike that in the transformation scene of a Christmas pantomime. It had all started when Paddington had come across an article in one of Mrs. Brown's older housekeeping magazines. The article in question had been about the amount of wasted space there was in a big city like London, and how, with some thought and a lot of hard work, even the worst rubbish dump could be turned into a place of beauty. The article had contained a number of photographs showing what could be done, and Paddington had been so impressed by these that he had taken the magazine along to show his friend. Mr. Gruber kept an antique shop in the Portobello Road, and although his backyard wasn't exactly a dumping ground, over the years he had certainly collected a vast amount of rubbish, and in the event he had decided to make a clean sweep of the whole area. For several days there had been a continual stream of rag and bone men, and then soon afterwards builders' lorries became a familiar sight behind the shop as they began to arrive, carrying loads of broken paving stones, sand, gravel, cement, rocks and other items of building material too numerous to be mentioned. Taking time off each afternoon, Mr. Gruber had set about the task of laying the crazy paving, while Paddington acted as foreman in charge of cement mixing and filling the gaps between the stones, a job which he enjoyed no end. At the far end of the yard, Mr. Gruber erected a fence against which he planted some climbing roses, and in front of this they built a rockery which was soon filled with various kinds of creeping plants. In the middle of the patio, space had been left for a small pond containing some goldfish and a miniature fountain, while at the house end there now stood a carved wooden seat with room enough for 2. It was on this seat that Paddington and Mr. Gruber relaxed after their exertions each day, and finished off any buns which had been left over from their morning elevenses.
"I must say, we've been very lucky with the weather,"
said Mr. Gruber, as Paddington joined him and they took stock of the situation.
"It's been a real Indian summer, though without your help I should never have got it all done before the winter."
Paddington began to look more and more pleased as he sat down on the seat and listened to his friend, for although Mr. Gruber was a polite man, he wasn't in the habit of paying idle compliments. Mr. Gruber gave a sigh.
"If you half close your eyes and listen to the fountain, Mr. Brown," he said, "and then watch all the twinkling lights come on as it begins to get dark, you might be anywhere in the world. There's only one thing missing," he continued, after a moment's pause.
Paddington, who had almost nodded off in order to enjoy a dream in which it was a hot summer's night and he and Mr. Gruber were sipping cocoa under the stars, he sat up in surprise. "What's that, Mr. Gruber?" he asked anxiously, in case he'd left out something important by mistake.
"I don't know," said Mr. Gruber dreamily, "but there's something missing. What the whole thing needs is some kind of finishing touch, a statue or a piece of stonework. I can't think what it can be."
Mr. Gruber gave a shiver as he rose from his seat, for once the sun disappeared over the rooftops, a chill came into the air.
"We shall just have to put our thinking caps on, Mr. Brown," he said, "and not take them off again until we've come up with something. It's a pity to spoil the ship for a ha'porth of tar."
"Adrian Crisp, garden ornaments!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "What's that bear up to now?" She held up a small piece of paper. "I found it under his bed this morning. It looks as if it's been cut from a magazine. And my best carrier bag is missing. Mrs. Brown glanced up from her sewing. I expect it's got something to do with Mr. Gruber's patio, she replied. Paddington was rather quiet when he came in last night. He said he had his thinking cap on, and I noticed him poking about looking for my scissors. Mrs. Bird gave a snort. That bear's bad enough when he doesn't think of things, she said grimly. There's no knowing what's likely to happen when he rarely puts his mind to it. Where is he, anyway? I think he went out, said Mrs. Brown vaguely. She took a look at the scrap of paper Mrs. Bird had brought downstairs. Works of art, in stone, bought and sold. No item too small or too large. I don't like the sound of that last bit, broke in Mrs. Bird. I can see Mr. Gruber ending up with a statue of the Duke of Wellington in his back garden. I hope not, said Mrs. Brown. I can't picture even Paddington trying to get a statue onto a London bus. At least, she added uneasily, I don't think I can. Unaware of the detective work going on at number 32 Windsor Gardens, Paddington peered around with a confused look on his face. Altogether, he was in a bit of a daze. In fact, he had to admit that he had never ever seen anything quite like Mr. Crisp's establishment before. It occupied a large wilderness of a garden behind a ramshackle old house some distance away from the Browns, and as far as the eye could see, every available square inch of ground was covered by statues, seats, pillars, balustrades, posts, stone animals. The list was endless. Even Adrian Crisp himself, as he followed Paddington in and out of the maze of pathways, seemed to only have a very vague idea of what was actually there. Pray take your time, my dear chap, he exclaimed, dapping his face with a silk handkerchief as they reached their starting point for the third time. Some of these items are hundreds of years old, and I think they'll last a while yet. There's no hurry at all. Paddington thanked Mr. Crisp, and then peered thoughtfully at a pair of small stone lions standing nearby. They were among the first things he'd seen on entering the garden, and all in all they seemed to fit more closely with what he had in mind. I think I like the look of those, Mr. Crisp, he exclaimed, bending down in order to undo the secret compartment in his suitcase. Adrian Crisp followed the direction of Paddington's gaze, and then lifted a label attached to one of the lion's ears. I'm not sure if you'll be able to manage it, he said doubtfully. The pair are £570. Paddington remained silent for a moment as he tried to picture the combined weight of 570 jars of marmalade. I quite often bring all Mrs. Bird's shopping home from the market, he said at last. Adrian Crisp allowed himself a little laugh. Oh, dear me, he said. I'm afraid we're talking at cross purposes. That isn't the weight. That's how much they cost. £570! exclaimed Paddington, nearly falling over backwards with surprise. Mr. Crisp adjusted his bow tie and gave a slight cough as he caught sight of the expression on Paddington's face. I might be able to let you have a small fawn for £100, he said reluctantly. I'm afraid the tail's fallen off, but it's quite a bargain. If I were to tell you where it came from originally, you'd have quite a surprise. Paddington, who looked as if nothing would surprise him ever again, sat down on his suitcase and stared mournfully at Mr. Crisp. I can see you won't be tempted, my dear fellow, said Mr. Crisp, trying to strike a more cheerful note. How much did you actually think of paying? I was thinking of 10p, said Paddington hopefully. 10p. If Paddington had been taken by surprise a moment before, Adrian Crisp looked positively devastated. I could go to 40p if I break into my bun money, Mr. Crisp, said Paddington hastily. Don't strain your resources too much, Bear, said Mr. Crisp, delicately removing a lump of leaf mould from his suede shoes. This isn't a charitable institution, you know, he continued, eyeing Paddington with disfavour. It's been a lifetime's work collecting these items, and I can't let them go for a song. I'm afraid I've only got 40p, said Paddington firmly. Adrian Crisp took a deep breath. I suppose I might be able to find you one or two bricks, he said sarcastically. You'll have to arrange your own transport, of course, but... He broke off as he caught Paddington's eye. Paddington had a very hard stare when he liked, and his present one was certainly one of the most powerful he'd ever managed. Said Mr. Crisp, as he glanced around unhappily. Then his face suddenly lit up as he caught sight of something just behind Paddington. "The very thing," he exclaimed. "I could certainly let you have that for 40 pence. Paddington turned and looked over his shoulder. "Thank you very much, Mr. Crisp," he said doubtfully. "What is it?" "What is it?" Mr. Crisp looked slightly embarrassed. "I think it fell off something a long time ago," he said hastily. "I'm not sure what. Anyway, my dear fellow, 40 pence, you don't ask what it is. You should be thankful for small mercies." Paddington didn't like to say anything, but from where he was standing, Mr. Crisp's object seemed rather a large mercy. It was big and round, and it looked for all the world like a giant stone football. However, he carefully counted out his 40 pence and handed the money over before the owner had time to change his mind. "Thank you, I'm sure," said Mr. Crisp, reluctantly taking possession of a sticky collection of coins made up of several 5-penny pieces, a number of twopences, and a large pile of pennies. He paused as Paddington turned his attention to the piece of stone. "I shouldn't do that if I were you," he began, but it was too late. Almost before the words were out of his mouth, there came the sound of tearing paper. Paddington stood looking at the 2 string handles in his paw, and then at the sodden remains of brown paper underneath the stone. "Oh, that was one of Mrs. Bird's best carrier bags," he exclaimed hotly. "I did try and warn you, Bear," said Mr. Crisp. "You've got a bargain there. That stone's worth 40 pence of anybody's money just for the weight alone. If you'd like to hang on a moment, I'll roll it outside for you." Paddington gave Mr. Crisp a hard stare. "You'll roll it outside for me?" he repeated, hardly able to believe his ears. "But I've got to get it all the way back to the Portobello Road." Mr. Crisp took a deep breath. "I might be able to find you a cardboard box," he said sarcastically, "but I'm afraid we expect you to bring your own string for anything under 50 pence. Mr. Crisp looked as if he'd had enough dealings with bear customers for one day, and when, a few minutes later, he ushered Paddington out through the gates, he bade him a hasty farewell and slammed the bolt shut on the other side with an air of finality. Taking a deep breath, Paddington placed his suitcase carefully on top of the box, and then, clasping the whole lot firmly with both paws, he began staggering up the road in the general direction of Windsor Gardens and the Portobello Road. If the stone object had seemed large among all the other odds and ends in Mr. Crisp's garden, now that he actually had it outside, it seemed enormous. Several times he had to stop in order to rest his paws, and once, when he accidentally stepped on a grating outside of a row of shops, he nearly overbalanced and fell through a window. Altogether, he was thankful when at long last he peered round the side of his lord and caught sight of a small queue standing beside a familiar-looking London transport sign not far ahead. He was only just in time, for as he reached the end of the queue, a bus swept to a halt beside the stop, and a voice from somewhere upstairs bade everyone to "Hurry along." "Quick," said a man coming to his rescue, "there's an empty seat up front." Before Paddington knew what was happening, he found himself being bundled onto the bus while several other willing hands in the crowd took charge of the cardboard box for him and placed it in the gangway behind the driver's compartment. He barely had time to raise his hat in order to thank everyone for their trouble before there was a sudden jerk and the bus set off again on its journey. Paddington fell back into the seat, mopping his brow, and as he did so he looked out the window in some surprise. Although, as far as he could remember, it was a fine day outside, he distinctly heard what sounded like the ominous rumble of thunder. It had seemed quite close for a second or two, and he peered anxiously up at the sky in case there was any lightning about, but as far as he could make out, there wasn't a cloud anywhere in sight. At that moment, there came a clattering of heavy feet on the stairs as the conductor descended to the bottom deck. "Hello, hello," said a disbelieving voice a second later. "What's all this here?" Paddington glanced around to see what was going on, and as he did so, his eyes nearly fell out of their sockets. The cardboard box, which a moment before had stood neatly and innocently beside him, now had a gaping hole in its side. Worse still, the cause of the hole was now resting at the other end of the gangway. "Is this yours?" asked the conductor, pointing an accusing finger first at the stone by his feet, and then at Paddington. "I think it must be," said Paddington vaguely. "Well, I'm not having no bear's boulders on my bus," said the conductor. He indicated a notice just above his head. "It says here plain enough, parcels may be left under the staircase by permission of the conductor, and I ain't given me permission. No likely to, neither. Landed on me best corn, it did."
"It isn't a bear's boulder," exclaimed Paddington hotly. "It's Mr. Gruber's finishing touch." The conductor reached up and rang the bell. "It'll be your finishing touch and all if I have any more nonsense," he said crossly. "Come on, off with you." The conductor looked as if he'd been about to say a great deal more on the subject of bear passengers in general, and Paddington and his piece of stonework in particular, when he suddenly broke off. For as the bus ground to a halt, the storm suddenly began trundling back up the gangway, ending its journey with a loud bang against the wall at the driver's end. A rather cross-looking face appeared for a moment at the window just above it. Then the bus surged forward again, and before anyone had time to stop it, the storm began rolling back down the gangway, landing once more at the conductor's feet. "I've had just about enough of this," he exclaimed, hopping up and down as he reached for the bell. "We've gone past 2 requests and a compulsory as it is." The words were hardly out of his mouth when a by now familiar thundering sound, followed by an equally familiar thump, drowned the excited conversation from the other passengers in the bus. For a moment or two, the bus seemed to hover shaking in mid-air, as if one half wanted to go on and the other half wanted to stay. Then, with a screech of brakes, it pulled into the side of the road, and as it ground to a halt, the driver jumped out and came hurrying round to the back. "Why don't you make up your mind?" he cried, addressing his mate on the platform. "First you rings the bell to say you want to stop, then you bangs on me panel to say go on, then you rings the bell again, then it's bang on me panel. I don't know whether I'm on me head or me heels, let alone driving the bus." "I like that," exclaimed the conductor. "I banged on your panel. It was that blessed bear with his boulder that's done it." "A bear with a boulder?" repeated the driver disbelievingly. "Where? I can't see him." The conductor looked up the gangway, and then his face turned white. "He was there," he said, "and he had this boulder what kept rolling up and down the gangway. There he is," he exclaimed triumphantly. "I told you so." He pointed down the road to where, in the distance, a small brown figure could be seen hurrying after a round grey object as it zigzagged down the road. "It must have fallen off the last time you stopped." "Well, I hope he catches it before it gets to Portobello Road," said the driver. "If it gets in among all them barrows, there's no knowing what'll happen." "Bears," exclaimed the conductor bitterly as a sudden thought struck him. "He didn't even pay for his fare, let alone extra for his boulder." Paddington and Mr. Gruber settled themselves comfortably on the patio seat. After all his exertions in the early part of the day, Paddington was glad of a rest, and the sight of a tray laden with 2 mugs, a jug of cocoa, and a plate of buns into the bargain was doubly welcome. Mr. Gruber had been quite overwhelmed when Paddington presented him with a piece of stone. "I don't know when I've had such a nice present, Mr. Brown," he said, "or such an unexpected one. How you managed to get it all the way here by yourself, I really don't know." "It was rather heavy, Mr. Gruber," admitted Paddington. "I nearly strained my resources." "Fancy that conductor calling it a boulder," continued Mr. Gruber, looking at the stone with a thoughtful expression on his face. "Even Mr. Crisp didn't seem to know quite what it was," said Paddington, "but he said it was a very good bargain." "I'm sure he was right," agreed Mr. Gruber. He examined the top of the stone carefully and ran his fingers over the top, which appeared to have a flatter surface than the rest, and was surrounded by a rim not unlike a small tray. "Do you know what I think it is, Mr. Brown?" Paddington shook his head. "I think it's an old Roman cocoa stand," said Mr. Gruber. "A Roman cocoa stand?" repeated Paddington excitedly. "Well, perhaps it isn't exactly Roman," replied Mr. Gruber truthfully, "but it's certainly very old, and I can't think of a better use for it." He reached over for the jug, filled both mugs to the brim with steaming liquid, and then carefully placed them on top of the stone. To Paddington's surprise, they fitted exactly. "There," said Mr. Gruber, with obvious pleasure. "I don't think anyone could find a better finishing touch for their patio than that, Mr. Brown. Not if they tried for 1,000 years."